is standing by at Cape Canaveral. Bruce, what effect is this disaster expected to have on the space program, both manned and unmanned?
Well, it could have a real effect on the program, particularly the shuttle program, of course, because we've had 4 shuttles which we're operating with, and we've still fallen a little bit behind schedule, Dan, with that. And there has been tremendous pressure on NASA to keep those 4 shuttles operating and to keep on schedule, and they've still fallen behind. Now that we have lost one of the major shuttles, and we have lost the Challenger. This is the flight, the shuttle that has been used 10 of the 25 launches. It has been the Challenger. The Challenger has been the workhorse. The Challenger has been the shuttle that has had the least amount of technical troubles. So, therefore, it is going to be a major effect on the program from that standpoint. Now, there was not another shuttle scheduled to be launched until the first week in March. But it was a time, ironically, when NASA was a little concerned about the launch, because in March, they were going to try to launch 2 shuttles within 1 week. And for the very first time, they were going to put a Centaur rocket aboard one of the shuttles. This is one that would have liquid fuel, something that has never been done before. And
say that again to me, Bruce. I'm sorry, I didn't understand that.
Okay. One of the concerns that NASA had for the future, and this is something that was going to take place in May, I said March, in May, when NASA was going to launch one of the shuttles, and aboard that shuttle was going to be a Centaur rocket. Now, the crucial thing here is that the Centaur rocket, which we have fired from a number of places before, but the Centaur rocket that was going to be aboard the shuttle was going to have liquid propellants. And once again, we were in a position where we were talking about highly volatile substances to be put into space. And this was something that NASA has been real concerned about. There was very little concern about the launch today because it was the Challenger, and they were so pleased with the Challenger. They were sort of diverting some of their attention and looking forward, although the concern is always for safety here. Let me emphasize that. They were looking forward and trying to work out all of the problems in regard to the May launch, which was going to be another step forward for the program. And that was something that there was real concern about with NASA. And now, the fact that we have lost one, plus the fact that we'll have to have an extensive investigation, NASA will want to insist upon a very extensive investigation into this to see where the program goes from here. And while there probably will be some criticism, it is everyone's opinion here at the Kennedy Space Center, the program, of course, will go on. It will go on with 3 shuttles. There will be a strong move to bring forth a 4th shuttle. But there is a problem in trying to get a 4th vehicle, the 4th orbiter, in that the place where the shuttles are manufactured now is being geared up for the production of the B-1 bombers. So you can see we have several problems in connection with this terrible tragedy of today that are going to impact on the future of the program, and it is going to delay several of the missions. It is going to have a devastating effect on the shuttle program in the future. It is going to mean that we are, in all likelihood, going to have to delay our missions to Jupiter and delay probably for at least a year on our mission to Jupiter, which is a setback for NASA, is a serious setback for the entire space program. So we have something to deal with in the program that goes beyond just this tragedy, and that is the entire future of the program, Dan.
Bruce, for those who don't follow the space program anywhere nearly as closely as you do, you're talking about this Centaur rocket that was planned to be taken up on a space shuttle flight in May, correct?
Mm-hmm. That is correct.
Someone here said, well, how can they take a rocket up aboard the rocket? Well, again, using our scale model here, you have the space shuttle itself, its main liquid, well, it's liquid fuel tanks, and then its solid fuel boosters. These fall away. This tank eventually falls away, and the shuttle goes on into orbit. Remember, again, that the shuttle has this cargo bay, and that's what the cargo bay is designed for. Bruce, help me as we go along here, if you will. That
is correct.
A rocket was to be launched out of here. The plan for the May launch of the space shuttle was to put a Centaur rocket and see if it could be launched out of this cargo bay, correct?
That is correct, and that is part of really what NASA was calling the exciting future of the space program and the shuttle program, in that they were trying to make major advances in the program. And among the major advances includes things which bring safety into it and real safety problems, because they've been dealing with the liquid propellants aboard this Centaur rocket to make certain that they could do this and do this safely. And it was one of the major concerns, and it was expected to be a big advancement. The second advancement, that same time they were going to do that, they were going to attempt to launch a second shuttle in the same week, so that we were going to have 2 shuttle launches within 1 week. That is the reason that it was so important that today we were to launch a shuttle from what is known as Pad 39B. We have always, with the previous 24 shuttle missions, gone off from Pad 39A. But with the refurbishing of the second pad, that meant that the space program would take a major leap forward. They would be able to try new programs and be able to make further advances. And this was part of what Dick Scobie said, the commander of this flight, and his desire and his hope and his saying, as he told several people in his last days, that the real future is the development of outer space, and we have to be able to develop outer space, and this was the way that NASA was going to do it. So you have here, Dan, not only a tragedy today with the explosion aboard the Challenger and with everything that has occurred here, but you have a tragedy for the entire space program and for the future of the space program. And this is something that I'm sure in the coming weeks and the coming months we're going to hear a tremendous amount about, because it is going to obviously delay the shuttle program. It is going to delay trips to Jupiter like they had planned, and it is going to delay some of the long-range programs that they already have on the drawing board.
Bruce, I'm reminded that one of the many purposes of the Space Shuttle program was to get a new powerful telescope into outer space, away from the Earth's atmosphere. And it always was a very exciting prospect, I think, to many Americans, that to get a telescope, this had not yet happened. Some of the previous space shots had been designed to help it along, but part of the Space Shuttle program is to put a telescope into space where so much more can be seen. And once that telescope got into space, NASA was always pointing out that humans, for the first time, with a telescope aboard the shuttle in outer space, would be able to see many thousands of times much more of the cosmos than any human had ever been able to see before, because, of course, with earthbound telescopes, one is hampered by the Earth's atmosphere. All of that part of the Space Shuttle program. Leo Krupp in Los Angeles, could the pyrotechnics that are supposed to lead to separation of the solid rocket boosters from the spacecraft, could those pyrotechnics have been pre-ignited, and could that have been part of the problem? We're raising questions here. We want to emphasize that we simply don't know what caused the explosion aboard the shuttle, but could that have been one possible reason?
Well, I assume not, Dan, because if a separation sequence had been initiated and you actually blew the explosive bolts, you would have a normal separation. You wouldn't have a catastrophic explosion.
Leo Krupp, we want to show the videotape again, partly because we're eager for you to see it as often as possible in hopes that you might pick up some other clues, or it might raise questions in your mind. And also, we continue to say it, we say it because it's true. At this time of day, so many people are coming home from school or work or joining us in our coverage. The Space Shuttle Challenger blew up between 72 and 75 seconds after launch today at Cape Canaveral, Florida. This is the configuration of the Space Shuttle. The shuttle itself, the liquid fuel tank filled with liquid oxygen and hydrogen, something the Soviets have had trouble doing. This is the major fuel tank. The solid rocket boosters off to the side. As we play the videotape for you, the second time in slow motion, you will see the suspicious area along the left side of one of those solid rocket boosters. This was the scene this morning.
And liftoff.
Everything seemed fine for liftoff.
The 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Now control. Roger, roll, Challenger. Good, roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading downrange. Engines beginning throttling down now at 94%. Normal throttles for most of the flight, 104%. We'll throttle down to 65% shortly. Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs. velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles, downrange distance 3 nautical miles. Engines throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
Roger, go at throttle up.
1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
The fireball had happened. Debris begins to fall after the explosion. This part of the space shuttle overall vehicle, as it trailed smoke coming down into the ocean a short ways east of the launch site. You heard Commander Francis Scobie was told by Mission Control in Houston to throttle up.
Very carefully at the situation.
Then he said, oh, Roger, he was throttling up.
Major malfunction.
Mission Control in Houston, stunned, doesn't know what has happened, says,
We have no downlink.
obviously, there's been a malfunction, as they called it. No downlink, no communication. By this time, horror was setting in at Mission Control in Houston and everywhere as debris began to rain down into the sea. Now, the critical moments in slow motion. Look for the indication of explosion of small flame down low on the left-hand middle side of your picture. There they are. This is just before the major explosion. Then the igniting of the main fuel tank, where all that liquid hydrogen, 500,000 pounds of it, goes up. The spacecraft was traveling at close to 2,000 miles an hour at the time. It may not be an important point, but will someone please check that the speed was about 2,000 miles an hour. Those aboard the spacecraft today, commander and his pilot, co-pilot. The commander was Francis Dick Scobie, 46 years old, from the state of Washington, married and with 2 children. This was his second mission and his first command of a shuttle mission. He is a retired major from the United States Air Force. Michael Smith, the pilot, 40 years old, from Beaufort, North Carolina, married, 3 children. This was his first mission. He is a commander in the United States Navy and is a graduate of the United States Naval Academy. Mike Smith. Judith Resnick, mission specialist, 36 years old, PhD from Akron, Ohio, unmarried. She has a doctorate in electrical engineering and is a classical pianist. This was her second mission. She was trained to operate the shuttle's robot arm. Judith Resnick was the second American woman in space, Sally Ride being the first. This was Judith Resnick's second mission. Also aboard today, mission specialist Ronald McNair, 35 years old, from Lake City, South Carolina, married, father of 2 children. He has a doctorate in physics from Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. This was his second flight. McNair, one of the pioneering black astronauts. Mission specialist Ellison Onizuka, 39 years old, from Hawaii, married with 2 children, Air Force colonel. This was his second flight. His first flight was a secret one for the United States Defense Department, that controversial mission some months back when the Pentagon had a secret mission into space. Onizuka was aboard that mission. Today's mission was nothing secret about it. Among the things to be accomplished was an exploration of some of Halley's comet. Greg Jarvis, payload specialist, the employee of Hughes Aircraft, 41 years old. He is an electrical engineer. Greg Jarvis, the employees of Hughes Aircraft, he was bumped from 2 previous flights, but was finally getting a chance to go. His job was to conduct experiments on how liquids behave in the weightlessness of space. And Sharon Krista McAuliffe, 37-year-old social studies teacher, born in Boston, Massachusetts, a high school social studies teacher in Concord, New Hampshire. She's been a teacher since 1970 and was selected from some 11,146 American school teachers who applied to be NASA's first citizen in space. Married, 2 small children. She was to have taught 2 15-minute lessons, conducted class in space on day 4 of the mission. Not to be, since Space Shuttle Challenger exploded today shortly after launch. Now, some 1,200 students at the Concord, New Hampshire High School gathered this morning to watch the launch of the Space Shuttle Challenger and cheer on their teacher. Their social studies teacher, Krista McAuliffe, was on board, and the mood in the beginning and through the first 30 seconds was jubilant.
We have main engine start. 4, 3, 2, 1.
Be a loss to the school, but most of all, it'd be a loss to a family and a friends, and it's just too awful to contemplate. It's just awful. A thing like this would happen.
Schoolteacher McAuliffe's parents, Edward and Grace Corrigan, were watching from a VIP area about 3 miles from the launch pad. The scenes we just showed you were from Mrs. McAuliffe's school in Concord, New Hampshire. Terrible scene there when the joy of the liftoff turned to the horror of the ball of fire explosion. The parents of the school teacher, Mr. and Mrs. Corrigan, were watching from that VIP site near the launch pad. When the tragedy struck, the cheers there, of course, turned to shrieks of horror, and the Corrigans clutched each other in tears. NASA officials rushed in to shield them from the crowd and then immediately led them away. President Reagan has postponed the scheduled State of the Union address that was scheduled for tonight until next Tuesday. We're told the President intends to talk to the American people sometime during this late afternoon or evening. Time and form yet to be announced. CBS News intends to carry that live. I was glancing at the clock there because the NASA news conference, the first official word from NASA really since the tragedy, was to have taken place about 23 minutes ago at 3:30 at Cape Canaveral. Then we got word it was postponed until 4 o'clock. And of course, CBS News will be going to Cape Canaveral for live for that NASA news conference if it comes off as scheduled at 4 o'clock. House Speaker Tip O'Neill today, he talked about today's tragedy at a special House session. We may be able to give that to you later on as the afternoon goes along. But for those of you who've only had snippets of this story or who may be coming home saying, what is going on? The space is very dependable in the past. Space Shuttle Challenger, everything seemed to be all right this morning. And then just over a minute after liftoff, trouble, an explosion. No indication of any survivors, and the word to Cape Canaveral is, you've seen the ball of fire. How could there possibly be any survivors? NASA has said it had no indication of trouble. It has had nothing to say about what happened or why it happened. Now, because of our continuing coverage of this disaster, CBS has canceled the school break special scheduled for this afternoon. It will, of course, be broadcast at a later date. That note from our programming department. Now, we were saying that the space shuttle, when it just after lifted off this morning, no indication of trouble, and then it exploded. NASA, the always careful, conservative in the positive sense, National Administration and National Space Administration has been all day long trying to put together what snippets, what tidbits of information it can, and is now scheduled to hold this news conference in just a few minutes. But here was the launch this morning as it happened on our CBS News videotape.
2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Now controlling.
Roger, roll, Challenger.
Good roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading downrange. Engines beginning throttling down now at 94%. Normal throttles for most of the flight, 104%. We'll throttle down to 65% shortly. Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs. Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles. Downrange distance 3 nautical miles. Engines throttling up. 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
Up in a ball of flame, down in fire. NASA said the fine pieces of debris continued to fall into the impact area, that is just southeast of the launch pad, for nearly 45 minutes. Recovery boats and aircraft had to wait until the rain of debris stopped before entering the area. Paramedics parachuted into the water. Some of them leaped into the water from helicopters, seeking to find any trace of survivors. There was no trace. Only small pieces of debris. In slow motion videotape, this is what happened during the critical moments of the explosion. Indication of trouble in the lower middle left-hand side of his screen. Nobody knows what it could have been. Then signs that a larger explosion is coming. And the main fuel tank goes. After the explosion, the 2 solid fuel booster rockets separated. At least one of them continued to fly crazily out of control in the clear sky, trailing long tails of smoke before it plummeted into the seas. You will see a small, well, perhaps a piece of the right-hand side solid rocket booster in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. Once the fireball, the worst of it, there you see it in the upper right-hand corner. What is believed to have been the right side, as you sit on the shuttle, right side solid rocket booster. The trouble, one theory is, began in the left side solid rocket booster. Television pictures of the impact area showed, as I say, only those very, very small pieces of debris. The search continues. We now have a short film showing schoolteacher Krista McAuliffe. First, when Vice President Bush announced her selection last July as the first American private citizen to be a space shuttle passenger, a space voyager. And then later, Mrs. McAuliffe of Concord, New Hampshire, and the mother of 2, underwent training in the long preparation for today's flight. At a news conference, she talked about her experience. This was part of the weightlessness training, just so familiar to anyone who's followed the space program.
One of the things that I hope to bring back into the classroom is to make that connection with the students that they too are part of history, that the space program belongs to them, and to try to bring them up with the space age.
These are other photographs of training of schoolteacher Krista McAuliffe. She tried to get herself in better physical condition, went through the medical tests, having been chosen from among more than 11,000 teachers selected for this flight. She posed proudly beside the Space Shuttle Challenger, went through that long, arduous preparation. Recall that Judy Resnick, the other woman aboard today's flight, had been waiting 6 years for her flight into space. This was her second flight. Now today, boarding the bus for the launch. Schoolteacher McAuliffe and the other 6 Americans, looking so forward to what they were convinced would be another successful launch. 24 space shuttle launches, 56 American manned space launches, with never a death before. There were 3 deaths in 1967 on the pad, but that was before launch. Today's the first disaster in space flight for this country. Mrs. McAuliffe was a social studies teacher in Concord, And the other woman, as we mentioned, aboard with her, she was selected from the 11,000 teachers applicants. Now, Judy Resnick, who was the mission specialist, had been selected through a whole different process, part of the what we now call the routine process of selecting men and women as part of the space program. And Judith Resnick, the second American woman in space, Sally Ride had been the first. Judith Resnick talked about what it was like to be the second woman in space.
Is there anything that needs to be said about the second woman in space? The U.S. woman?
I'm very comfortable flying with this crew. We have gotten along very well from the beginning. We work well together. We have a good time in training. I'm very comfortable with the whole mission in general, and I view myself as part of the team. There's 6 of us, and I have about 1/6 of the responsibility, and the other guys have about 1/6, and that's the way we intend to do it on orbit, and we're all very comfortable with that. And I'm very confident of their abilities, and I think they're very confident of my abilities in the areas that I have responsibilities, and I trust them in the areas that I don't know that much about to go do the right thing, and we have that mutual trust among us, and I think that will make for a good mission because we have a good crew.
What does Judith think about going to space?
Well, I'm eager to go.
A long time waiting.
I've been here for 6 years. I think it's about time, the right length of time to be at NASA and working in the system before you go fly. There are a lot of people who have waited longer for flights. There are some who have waited less time for flights. I'm very satisfied with where I am right now. I'm ready to go fly this mission with the rest of the crew, and I hope after the mission's over that NASA wants me to fly another one.
Judith Resnick, 36 years old, from Akron, Ohio, unmarried. She has a doctorate in electrical engineering. She's also a classical pianist. This was her second space mission after becoming the second American woman in space behind Sally Ride. This was to be her second mission in space. And if you say to yourself, well, what was it that these women do up there? What does the men do up there? This particular woman, this woman astronaut, this American hero, was trained to operate the shuttle's robot arm. Now, for those of you who have forgotten or perhaps haven't followed the space program too carefully, that once the space shuttle in normal launches, successful launches, once the solid rocket boosters separated out, the main fuel tank separated out, and the space shuttle itself got up out there on the high frontier, in the cargo bay of the space shuttle, that Canadian manufactured robot arm. Now, remember, the crew is up in here. This is the cargo area where the satellites that are launched out from the space shuttle are carried, where the Centaur rocket for later this year was to have been launched from. In this cargo bay area, there's a robot arm that the robot arm helps get things out of this cargo bay. Yes, if there's real trouble or for other purposes, the astronauts can get out and take a spacewalk around, and they can work in this cargo bay, but most of the work is designed to be done by the robot arm. And you have to train somebody to operate that robot arm, and Judith Resnick, the second American woman in space, today off on her second mission in space, was an expert in operating that robot arm. That's what she was to do. Among other things, that this particular space mission was to launch and retrieve from the cargo bay of the space shuttle one satellite that was to help study Halley's Comet. There was also to be another satellite launched from that cargo bay, which was to stay out in space and be part of NASA's communications network. That was among the many missions designed for this particular space shuttle voyage. Also, school teacher Krista McAuliffe was to conduct 2 classroom sessions from outer space. The NASA news conference, which had been scheduled for about 40 minutes ago originally at 3:30 Eastern Time and then was put back to 4 p.m. Eastern Time, has yet to start. We are told that it still will be taking place at Cape Canaveral, Florida, but clearly we're past the scheduled time, even the rescheduled time for it, and so we will just have to see when that news conference is held. When it is held, we will of course be going live to Cape Canaveral, Florida. President Reagan has postponed his scheduled State of the Union address for tonight to next Tuesday. We're now told the President will be addressing the American people at 5 o'clock Eastern Time this afternoon. President Reagan earlier in the day, he first said that, first sent out word that he'd go ahead with the State of the Union address. Understandably, the White House had second thoughts about that, and on the urging of Bob Michaels, the Republican leader in the House, and Bob Dole, the Senate Majority Leader, President Reagan and his aides reconsidered. They postponed tonight's scheduled State of the Union message until next Tuesday, then said the President would be talking to the American people sometime late this afternoon or this evening. Now there's word the President plans that at about 5 o'clock Eastern time this afternoon. That'd be 4 o'clock in the Central Time Zone, and would be 2 o'clock in many places in the West, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. President Reagan will be talking to the American people about today's tragedy in space. After 56 successful manned spacecraft launches, the first American manned spacecraft disaster. Now, this launch was the 56th manned space launch for the United States. It was the 25th shuttle launch. We had some debate earlier in the day whether this was the 24th or 25th. Bruce Hall, ever on the alert, has checked and double-checked. It was the 25th shuttle launch. It was the 10th launch for this particular shuttle orbiter called the Challenger. And as Bruce Hall mentioned earlier, this particular orbiter called the Challenger was considered to be NASA's most dependable one, because this was its 10th launch after all, and the others had all been successful. As we wait for the NASA news conference to begin at Cape Canaveral, Florida, we're going to try to call in Bruce Hall and see if Bruce is still there, if he hasn't left his position at the Cape for the news conference itself. Bruce, hope I didn't catch you drinking a cola or something there. But what's the situation on this news conference? Why the delay, or has there been any word on why the delay?
Dan, there has been no official word on why there is a delay, but this is not unusual. What NASA plans to do is have Associate Administrator Jess Moore, a person who is extremely familiar with the shuttle program, come over and brief the press and then be available for questions. He has done this many times in the past, and sometimes we have had schedules which have been delayed like this, and he has told us afterwards, he said, I set up these press briefings for when we think they're going to be held, but before I come over to talk to the media present, I want to make certain I have all of the answers that we have at that time. So he says that frequently the meetings and the briefings are delayed so he can confer and have further conferences with all of the people involved so that he has the information that is necessary. He is, as we've said, very involved in the program. Has basically been in charge of the Space Shuttle program, just recently named to be the new director of Johnson Space Center in Houston. He has been here at Kennedy Space Center. He talked to us several times already on this mission. But I am quite certain, Dan, that he is having further conferences because he wants to be able, if he has always done in the past, once he faces the media, to have some definitive answers. Now, I think in talking to other people at NASA, we can be assured that he is not going to be able to say exactly what happened. And that is, as Leo Crumpet indicated earlier, and several other people have said, it is going to take weeks, maybe even months, before they can determine exactly what happened. But I think that we can anticipate that Jess Moore, when he does finally face the media here at the Kennedy Space Center, he will have some very preliminary answers. And we can anticipate that he can talk directly to what happened on the shuttle before the explosion occurred. I think we can also anticipate that he will be able to give us a little more explanation and maybe a little more detail about the vapors that we have talked about and the flames that we have seen from the slow motion tapes about a second or so before the explosion occurred. Now, I've just been told that the Jess Moore press conference has been set now for 4:15, which is just about 3 minutes or so from now. Hopefully, I believe that he is now in the area where the media is located. We are in the press area, which is almost, well, it's more than a mile from the main administrative offices of NASA, but we're only a couple of hundred yards from the vehicle assembly building where the launch control activities took place and where he has been for much of the afternoon conferring with different launch officials and with people in the Launch Control Center. So I believe that Jess Moore is now in the area so that we should, in fact, be able to hear something from him very shortly, and the indication is 4:15, just a couple of moments from now.
Well, Bruce, in preparation for that news conference, let's take a look again at the launch itself and the slow motion replay, and I want you to narrate this, if you will, and call particular attention when we get into the slow motion part of those two very suspicious flame-up areas, smaller flame-up areas before the great explosion occurred. Let's take a look at the launch itself and then in slow motion.
We have main engine
We
start.
had concern about ice in the launch area. It was delayed for an hour. But according to a very, very preliminary report from NASA, everything was fine right at liftoff. We've gone through the first few seconds after liftoff. Everything appears to be normal. I have viewed about 20 of these liftoffs in the past. There appeared to be nothing out of the ordinary. And it was not until we get almost a minute 10 into the flight when you see the first indication of trouble. And on the radio and on the report from NASA, they indicated they've had no difficulty at all reported from the shuttle, and none of their gauges indicated any difficulty either. It is now going out over the ocean. It is several miles downrange from the Kennedy Space Center, about 4 miles at this point. And once we get to about a minute 10, and we get to a different shot, they're at maximum thrust. They come up. This is the time that is most vulnerable for the shuttle. And we should look at the bottom section of the shuttle where you see what appear to be almost a fog or fumes or vapors. And that occurs about a second before. Watch closely. A second before you have the fireball and the major explosion. The major explosion was the main fuel tank exploding. It appears from everything we have been able to see that the solid rocket boosters, now you can see right there at the bottom of your picture, you see on both sides what appeared to be fumes or possibly a fire. You now see the explosion right at the base of, well, right next to where the astronauts are in the shuttle itself, at the point where the orbiter is connected to the main fuel tank. And that was the fireball. The astronauts have said that the launch itself is just like a fireball because you're being propelled with all of this highly volatile liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen into orbit. And at a period where the explosion took place, at the time of the explosion, they were at maximum thrust. In other words, as you can see, a solid rocket booster, which is falling off to the right of the picture. There is some concern, and some people at NASA have indicated they're looking very closely at those two solid rocket boosters, that and the main fuel engine. Those are the areas that very early, and we must repeat, very early indications are that there was some type of problem. It appeared from everything that those who have been viewing the tapes that there was some type of leak. We do not know why. There has been no indication and no official word from NASA yet as to what could have caused that. The speculation centers around two things. One, on the solid rocket booster, somehow there was a hole. Somehow a hole on the solid rocket booster created a release, and that then created the fire which caused the explosion. The second theory is that a seam right next to the shuttle itself, right at the point where the shuttle is attached to the main fuel tank, that there may have been a rupture for some very unknown reason, and at that point there was an immediate explosion.
Bruce?
But it is still very early, Dan.
I was just going to say, Bruce, the one thing we want to emphasize as we go through with our coverage, it is still very early on. NASA was, to say the least, taken aback, horrified, of course, but taken aback because so far as could be immediately determined, there was no indication of trouble aboard the spaceship. When Bruce Hall says that the area of early question centers on the solid rocket boosters, this is what he's talking about, these two solid rocket boosters that go along the sides of the space shuttle, as you saw in the slow motion pictures. there seemed to be a indication of some flaming up in this area of these solid rocket boosters, which are designed to fall away from the spacecraft. Down on the lower left-hand solid rocket booster is one suspicious area. Just before the major explosion, two suspicious-looking what could have been vapor flame-ups there. Now, these solid rocket boosters have fuel that's the texture of sort of rubber, and it is true that you can beat on it with a sledgehammer and not ignite it or make it explode. However, it can put off and does put off some vapors, and one question is, did vapors from this solid rocket booster somehow get out in here and cause ignite and then cause the major explosion with the liquid fuel that's in the larger tank? These are solid fuel rockets. This is the liquid tank from which the space shuttle or orbiter itself, with its 3 engines at the base, takes its fuel from here. Now, the whole thing was still together about a minute and 12 seconds into the launch when the explosion occurred. And what Bruce was talking about right down in here on this left-hand solid booster rocket is one suspicious area. Now, no one can say with any certainty that that's the area in which it all started. From the slow-motion videotape, it is a suspicious area. Of course, when you're carrying 500,000 pounds of liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen in this main tank, the seams that hold that main tank together are another area of question mark and another area of suspicion. Clearly, once the major explosion, once the ball of flame that you saw did include the main tank, but question, did it start in the solid rocket fuel boosters and that ignited the main tank, or was the original problem with the highly volatile liquid hydrogen in the main tank? When we talk about the orbiters, when they name these Space Shuttle Columbia, Space Shuttle Challenger, and so on, they're talking about just the orbiter. And just this part is all that actually goes out into space. First, the solid rocket boosters fall off, then the liquid tank, after it's done its job, falls off, and the space shuttle with its engines right in the rear goes on out into space and goes into orbit. Space Shuttle Challenger had done that 10 times. Well, today was to have been the 10th time, and today it went up in flames. Aboard the space shuttle today, and presumed killed in that fireball, were the commander, Major Francis Dick Scobie, 46 years old, from Auburn, Washington, married, 2 children, second mission, his first command of a shuttle mission, retired major from the Air Force. His pilot, second in command, Mike Smith, 40 years old, from Beaufort, North Carolina, married, 3 children. His first mission, he was a commander of the United States Navy, a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy. Also aboard today, mission specialist Judith Resnick, 36 years old, from Akron, Ohio, doctorate in electrical engineering. Her second mission, trained to operate the shuttle's robot arm. Ronald McNair, mission specialist, 35 years old, from Lake City, South Carolina, married, 2 children, doctorate in physics from MIT. This was his second flight. Mission specialist Ellison Onizuka, 39 years old, from Hawaii, married, 2 children, Air Force colonel. This was his second flight. Greg Jarvis, payload specialist from Hughes Aircraft, 41 years old, an electrical engineer. His job was to conduct experiments on how liquids behave in the weightlessness of space. And Susan Krista McAuliffe, 37-year-old social studies teacher from New Hampshire, and the mother of 2. Veteran test pilot Chuck Yeager, the man who originally broke the sound barrier, the first man to break the sound barrier, talked about the dangers of flight.
Not as dangerous? Or?
Well, it takes an accident like this to generate comments that you hear now about, you know, safety and things like this, as it occurred in the Stretch DC-8 accident in Gander. You know, it generated a big flap about air safety, and this will generate a flap about safety in space. And we've gone through this before in the Apollo fire that killed Gus Grissom and Ed White and another astronaut. But the point is, you have accidents when you're fooling around. You have accidents in automobiles and accidents around the house, but you've got to expect them, obviously. And one thing that this will bring about, I'm quite sure, is a tightening up of the systems. And whether or not it merits a tightening up of the system, that's what will come out of the accident investigation.
Chuck Yeager, the original American pilot of The Right Stuff, talking today about the dangers of flight. A catastrophic explosion blew apart the Space Shuttle Challenger, apparently sending schoolteacher Krista McAuliffe and 6 NASA astronauts to the fiery death in the sky some 8 miles out from the Kennedy Space Center. Never before in 56 manned space flights had Americans died in flight. 3 died on the launch pad in 1967, but that was on the launch pad as part of the Apollo program. So far as can be determined, we know that at least 4 Soviet cosmonauts have died in space accidents. 1 was reported in 1967 and 3 in 1971. But the Soviet program, which is primarily in the hands of the military and is a closed, not open to coverage program, it's always difficult to ascertain with any accuracy about what has not happened to the Soviets in space. Congressman Tip O'Neill, the Speaker of the House, also talked about today's tragedy.
Space Shuttle carried on its side the flag of the United States, and those who served on her served us, the American people. They served our hopes for scientific exploration and for human progress, but they also served our dreams because they lived at the frontier of what mankind can achieve together.
Tip O'Neill, speaking of the frontiers of space, the high frontier. The explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger followed an apparently flawless launch. It had been delayed for 2 hours because, among other things, of cold weather. Icicles were all over the Space Shuttle and its apparatus, but NASA waited 2 hours, delayed 2 hours, and felt confident as the icicles melted away that the weather, although it was about 28 degrees, unusually cold for this part of Florida this morning, although it had been that cold, NASA felt that after a 2-hour delay it could make the launch and make it successfully. The tragedy defies any easy explanation. You've heard, as part of our CBS News live coverage today, all kinds of theories, an hypothesis here and a hypothesis there, and ideas of where the questions are. But it's suffice to say, as we await this NASA news conference now, that nobody knows. As far as it can be determined, nobody even has any empirical evidence of exactly what happened and why it happened. A quote that we have from the Johnson Space Center in Houston, a source who asked not to be identified, said that, quote, there were no signs of abnormalities on the screens. This is NASA's own many monitoring screens of the flight. There are no signs of abnormalities on the screens as the flight controllers monitored Challenger's liftoff this morning. The source at the Johnson Space Center in Houston said that the blast occurred, quote, unexpectedly and with absolutely no warning. Mission Control reported that there had been no indication of any problem with the 3 shuttle engines. Remember that the orbiter itself has at its base 3 powerful engines. There'd been no indication of trouble with those. That the twin solid boosters on the outside of the main liquid fuel tank, the solid rocket boosters, its twin solid boosters had not indicated any trouble at all, or had there been any indication of any trouble in any other system. And according to this source, who asked not to be identified at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, there was no other indication that the space shuttle was on the verge of suddenly blowing apart some 10 miles high and 8 miles downrange of Cape Canaveral. The space shuttle carrying 500,000 pounds of fuel and traveling at a speed of almost 2,000 miles per hour. For those of you who heard it during the day, that the Mission Control in Houston, the commander had throttled back, as is the routine, to about 60 to 65% of full power, and then was told to throttle up. He said, Roger, throttling up. That was the last thing heard from the spaceship. Seconds after that, there was indication of 2 minor flame-ups, and then the huge ball of fire. President Reagan watched tape replays in what the White House called stunned silence, and he eventually postponed the State of the Union message. At first, the White House said the State of the Union message scheduled for tonight at 9 p.m. Eastern Time would go ahead, but very quickly was reconsideration of that after consultation with leading Republican members of Congress. And now President Reagan's aides say there will be no State of the Union address tonight. That's been postponed until next Tuesday. There will be, scheduled at 5 o'clock now, Eastern Time, 4 o'clock in the Central Time Zone, a talk to the American people by President Reagan, and CBS News. As part of our continuing live coverage, we'll, of course, cover that live. Right now, the next event that has been scheduled, actually it's been postponed several times this afternoon, and understandably so, is a NASA news conference at Cape Canaveral, Florida. The NASA news conference originally was scheduled for about an hour ago, then it was postponed a half hour, then it was postponed another 15 minutes, and we still are waiting for it to occur. Jess Moore, who is the director of the Johnson Space Center in Houston, is said to be at the Cape Canaveral launch site in Florida, and it's believed that Director Jess Moore, when that NASA briefing begins, will conduct the briefing from the Kennedy Space Center. Now, if that happens over the next 15 to 20 minutes, the NASA briefing in Florida, that would be followed very shortly by President Reagan's talk to the American people, scheduled for 5 o'clock Eastern Time, 4 o'clock in the Central Time Zone, and at 2 o'clock in the afternoon in many places in the West. And all of that, of course, will be part of our continuing CBS News coverage. For those of you who are just joining us or have caught only snippets or tidbits of what's happened during the day, at shortly after 11:30 this morning Eastern Time, the always previously dependable Space Shuttle Challenger, after a 2-hour delay because of weather, was blasted off from the Cape Canaveral Kennedy Space Center. It took off from a new launch pad, not one that it had previously used. A new launch pad, a different one, was being used today. The flight seemed perfectly all right, on target and on time for the first about minute and 10 seconds of the flight. About a minute and 12 to 15 seconds into the flight, disaster and a nightmare of a fireball. Nobody knows, nobody has said what may have caused it, why it may have happened. 7 Americans, including schoolteacher Krista McAuliffe from Concord, New Hampshire, were aboard that space shuttle. Bruce Hall, in Cape Canaveral, if you're still with us, and what a day this has been at Cape Canaveral, never a disaster like this one in the history of the American space program. It's worth talking about how bad a setback this may be for the manned space program of the United States and where this leaves us vis-a-vis the Soviets.
Well, Dan, you're right. There has never been a setback like this, never been a tragedy like this. There have been a couple of emergencies in the air with the space shuttle, but nothing of this magnitude and nothing like this has hit the space program before. We have had some problems on the launch pad with the 25 launches that we have had. Previous to this, the 24 launches, there had been 10 which were delayed at least a day by mechanical problems. And Dan, I see that Jess Moore, the Associate Administrator of NASA, is now ready to make a briefing.
Jess Moore, Director of the Johnson Space Center at Cape Canaveral, Florida.
As I address you here this afternoon. At 11:40 a.m. this morning, space program experienced a national tragedy with the explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger approximately a minute and a half after launch from here at the Kennedy Space Center. I regret that I have to report that based on very preliminary searches of the ocean where the Challenger impacted this morning, these searches have not revealed any evidence that the crew of Challenger survived. The dedicated crew members of Challenger are Commander Francis Dick Scobie, pilot Michael J. Smith, mission specialist Dr. Judy Resnick, Ellison Onizuka, and Dr. Ronald McNair. And payload specialists on board were Krista McAuliffe and Greg Jarvis. All early indications in the Launch Control Center, the Kennedy Space Center, have indicated that the launch was normal up to approximately 11:40 a.m. this morning, about a minute or so into the flight. Flight controllers in the Launch Control Center here and in the Mission Control Center in Houston were polled immediately after the explosion, reported that they did not see anything unusual up to that point. The solid rocket booster recovery ships were immediately dispatched to the area approximately 18 or so miles downrange from Kennedy, along with various Coast Guard and military ships, helicopters, and planes. I have taken an immediate action to form an interim investigating board to implement early activities in this tragedy. Data from all of the shuttle instrumentation, photographs, launch pad systems, hardware, cargo, ground support systems, and even notes made by any member of the launch team and flight ops team are being impounded for study. A formal board will be established by the acting administrator very, very shortly. Subsequent reports on this tragedy will be made by this formal review board. I am aware and have seen the media is showing footage of the launch today from the NASA Select system. We will not speculate as to the specific cause of the explosion based on that footage. It will take all the data, careful review of that data, before we can draw any conclusions on this national tragedy. Thank you.
Mr. Moore has time for just a couple of questions from each center before returning to the effort in investigating this tragedy. Please wait for the microphone and give your name and your affiliation. And we'll start right here with Jacqueline Bolden from Channel 6.
There were some reports that the shuttle perhaps rose a little slower than in previous launches, and there seemed to be a loud noise, and then the noise kind of backed off, and then a rush of noise again. Did you get any reports from anyone else that this seemed different from the people who either experienced it, saw it here live?
I have not heard any reports at all relative to that effect that you just described. None whatsoever.
Okay. Up here in the third row, Michael.
My name's Kevin Hamilton from WGIR in Manchester. The entire Teacher in Space program was designed to introduce more people, specifically youngsters, to the space program. This obviously is not the introduction you intended to make. What do you think the effect, the long-term impact that this is going to have on the youngsters that you were hoping to attract?
Well, I think we'll have to address that as time goes on. And again, I think today, the events of the day makes it much too early for me to speculate on the long-term impacts.
Okay, Al Selstead from Baltimore Sun in the first row.
Mr. Moore, at this time, do you have any estimate of how much liquid fuel was in the external tank at the time of the explosion, and how much explosive power, say in terms of TNT, that remaining liquid fuel might have been equal to?
No, sir, not at this time. You realize what we've been doing since 11:40 this morning is we immediately pulled our senior management together in this program, and I formed an interim board to ensure that all relevant data to this event would be impounded and would be made accessible to the investigative people that will go and take a look at it. I can't answer your specific questions relative to how much fuel was on board at this point in time. The board, when it's formally reported by the administrator, formally formed by the acting administrator, I'm sure will go into those kinds of questions, but I can't answer it right now.
Okay, we're going to take one more question here before going to the Johnson Space Center for questions. Here in the right opposite you, Jackie.
Peter Van Sant from CBS News. We received a call today from a member of an academic group who said he was on a tour group that was at the Pad 39B on Saturday night. This group was supposed to get off the bus to take a close look at the shuttle, but was not allowed to because this caller says they were told that a derrick arm had struck one of the tanks on the shuttle and that some repair work was being done. Are you aware of this incident, and are you aware of any problems at all with any of with either the external tank or the two solid rocket boosters?
No, we looked at that on Saturday. There was not even in the same area that of the tank. It was a small box, heater box, that had about a quarter of an inch of the insulation out of 5 inches that was scraped. It was a very minor scrape. It was repaired, and everybody, all the experts in the program, took a look at that, and so we closed it off at that point in time.
Wait for the microphone. I have to have the microphone.
There was no damage to any tank, or this arm did not strike any tank as far as
Not to my knowledge.
Okay, we're going to the Johnson Space Center for questions. Just a couple of questions.
Yeah, this is the Johnson Space Center. We have a question from Paul Reeser, Associated Press.
Yes, Mr. Moore. Was there
any debris of any description recovered by the vessels, and if so, what was it?
We do not have any detailed debris reports at this point in time. That certainly is something that we're looking at, and we will be impounding all the debris that we recover, and we've set up plans here to store that debris so that the investigating group can go in and look at that and assess that in great detail. I do not have any detailed reports right now on debris.
Okay. Bruce Nichols.
Mr. Moore, with all the delays that you experienced last week, the delay again this week, was there any pressure building at all to try to get this one off the ground? Was the pressure up there? And who made the final decision to go or no go?
There was absolutely no pressure to get this particular launch off. We have always maintained that flight safety is our top priority consideration in the program, and we look at the status and readiness of the systems based on that. We thoroughly reviewed the activities over the weekend and yesterday, and continually reviewed the status of Challenger right up until launch this morning. All of the people involved in this program, to my knowledge, felt that Challenger was quite ready to go, and I made the decision, along with the recommendation from the team supporting me, that we launch.
We're going to the Marshall Space Flight Center for a couple of questions.
Martin Berkey with Huntsville Times. Can you tell me what this does to the schedule on down the line, including the launch at Vandenberg?
No, I'm not prepared to do that. What I have done is basically suspend operations for a few days till we can sit down and assess this. And, you know, we're obviously not going to pick up any flight activity until we fully understand what the circumstances were relative to this morning's launch. So in the interim, near-term time, we've basically suspended operations until we get a handle on what our problems were this morning.
Nick Miller, WAFF Television in Huntsville. What part will Marshall Space Flight Center play in the investigation, since the propulsion system was the responsibility of the Space Flight Center here?
Well, they obviously have to play a very strong role in the investigating what happened this morning. As you know, the Space Shuttle program is built around a team effort, not only involving the Marshall Center, but also the Kennedy Space Center and the Johnson Space Center. All of the elements have different responsibilities, and clearly Marshall has the propulsive responsibilities on the shuttle. They will play a very dominant role, as will the other three centers I mentioned, as well as anybody that is contributing to the overall program and has some relevant information to add will certainly play a part.
Okay, we're moving to Washington for questions from NASA headquarters. Okay, there is a problem with our audio circuits to Washington. We are going to the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena.
Bill Hines of the Chicago Sun-Times. Mr. Moore, in your opening remarks, you mentioned the appointment of this interim review board and said that it would be making statements from time to time. Not to put any adverse interpretations on this, it sounds a little bit like a news blackout, and I'm wondering if your objective is to consolidate information, what will be the point of issue of all those announcements in the future? And are other people not involved in that review board forbidden to talk?
Well, let me correct your statement. First of all, I said that I had appointed an interim review board. That interim review board is composed of the senior members of the NASA team here to take immediate actions on impounding data. The acting administrator is expected to appoint a formal review board very shortly, and it will be left up to that review board in order to determine its progress reports in terms of their findings. What we have done here today is to move very quickly so that all relevant data could be impounded, and all actions that are needed to be taken in order to preserve as much information as we can on the circumstances of this morning can be preserved. And that's the nature of the work that I've implemented today, and I expect a formal board to be established very, very shortly, within the next day or so, by the acting administrator.
This is Roy Neal, NBC News. Jess, you've said, I believe, that future flights are temporarily frozen. The United States space program, as a result, is at a halt. Now, based on your experience, how long would you estimate that this investigation will take? 6 months, a year, before you get back in business?
Roy, it is, as you know, it is very difficult to estimate that time. It's going to be a function of what the board finds were the difficulties today and what corrective actions have to be taken before we feel confident and feel safe to fly again. And I clearly am not in a position to speculate today the length of time involved in making that determination. It will be done just as quickly as we possibly can, but also as prudently as we possibly can and as thoroughly as we possibly can.
One more question from JPL.
Bill Hines again. I've got to follow up on that first question of mine. I understand now that there will be announcements made after the permanent board is appointed. Is that correct?
There will be an announcement, I'm sure, of the members of the permanent board, yes. I believe that will be correct, and then I think that board will determine its rate of reporting based on the progress of its findings.
Okay, we're going next to the Washington NASA headquarters.
Are there any indications of sabotage or attack on the shuttle?
Can't hear.
I'm sorry, we didn't read that question. And while they're repairing that circuit to Washington, we'll go to the Goddard Space Flight Center in Maryland.
Mark Weaver, WBAL Radio in Baltimore. Has this raised any questions about how reliable the space shuttle is? Might there just be too many things that could go wrong with a vessel this complicated?
Well, that question, I'm sure, will be asked, and I don't want to speculate on that at this point in time. That's certainly a logical question for somebody to ask.
Ken Carroll from WDVM in Washington. Were there any unusual weather conditions aloft or any unusual weather conditions during the launch?
None that we observed that I recall. We did put up some weather balloons early this morning. We did look at load conditions as we normally do, and the winds aloft looked good. We didn't have any exceedances as far as our load indicators are concerned, to my knowledge, and we thought everything was in good shape for a launch this morning.
Mr. Moore, I.J. Hudson from WRC-TV. Has it become a problem that you have been too good in the past, that the American people have seen flawlessly perform missions on TV almost routinely, and that something like this happens all of a sudden, it hits home even harder?
Well, I don't know how to answer your question specifically. We always strive in every flight that we perform to be as reliable and as safe as we possibly can, and to do everything that we can to ensure that the vehicle and the systems are all ready to fly. Flight safety is our #1 priority in the Space Shuttle program. And certainly when you see an event like this morning, we are going to have to do a very detailed assessment of the set of circumstances to try to understand what occurred, and we will then in turn assess the impacts from that to determine where we go in the future.
I think you can hear it over the speaker.
Okay, back here at the Kennedy Space Center, we only have time for a couple more questions. Jay Barbary from NBC News in the front row here.
Jess, I would like to know if you know what happened to Challenger. Can we assume that it was consumed in the explosion? And can you tell us specifically what you know now that the recovery crew has recovered in the impact area?
I have not gotten a briefing, Jay, on what the recovery team has found at this point in time. And I have basically looked at the NASA select photos and so forth that you did, and all I can say is that it appeared from those photos that there was an explosion. And that's about all I can say at this point in time.
Okay, we have time for only one more question, and James Fisher from the Orlando Sentinel has had his hand up a long time.
Jess, I realize this is a rather forward-thinking question, but what is the situation with the Rockwell plant about the possibility for ordering another shuttle? Has the assembly line been shut down? What's the situation with that?
Well, as we've discussed in the past, We are manufacturing structural spares for an orbiter system, and that manufacturing process is continuing. We are also buying spares for the current fleet that we have, and there is a production capability there if and when it's decided that that's the next step we want to do, is to move forward and do that. So I think the bottom line answer to your question is yes, that is a possibility, that we could implement a production capability for another orbiter if that were decided to be the thing to do.
Okay, I'm sorry to have to wind this up now. Mr. Moore has to get back immediately. As you know, he's been here since very early in the morning, and there's much to be done. Thank you all. Thank you.
Live from Cape Canaveral, Florida, in the wake of the sudden disaster that struck the Space Shuttle Challenger today, the Challenger exploding and turning into a ball of fire shortly after liftoff from Cape Canaveral, Florida this morning, just after 11:30 a.m. Eastern Time today. That was Jess Moore, the director of the Johnson Space Center in Houston, briefing reporters at the Kennedy Space Center at Cape Canaveral, Florida, and bringing in the voices of reporters from various other places in the country. Recapping briefly, the first official word since the accident from NASA, searchers have turned up no evidence of survivors among the 7 Americans on board Space Shuttle Challenger. Flight controllers, all of them, say right up until the time of the explosion, there was no indication of anything abnormal about the launch or the spacecraft itself. A formal panel of inquiry has been formed. NASA says it will not speculate. It will not speculate on what went wrong or even hazard a guess based on the videotape footage of the accident alone. We'll be showing you that videotape footage very shortly. No speculation either on what might be the long-term effect of today's tragedy on the future of the shuttle program. Now, Leo Krupp, who has been with us over so many years of the space shuttle, of Rockwell International, a test pilot for the shuttle. You've just heard Jess Moore give this rather lengthy briefing and answer questions in what was, for the uninitiated among us, a kind of space babble. What did he say? Boil it down. What were the important points of what he said?
Well, I think the most important point he said is that NASA's has to look at the data, and this is what every accident investigation board will do, is before you can start running off making wild guesses and conjecture, you have to look at the data, put it together, and try to come out with a meaningful explanation of what happened. And I thought the briefing was extremely well done. NASA's taking a very conservative academic approach to this, which is the way it has to be done. The one question that I had in my mind that didn't come out in the briefing, and that is whether the solid rocket boosters have been recovered or are going to be recovered or not, because it appears in the footage we saw that both solid rocket boosters survived the explosion and were flying away, and their guidance came back, and you could see both boosters going out like the legs of a Y or the horns of a ram from the explosion area. So it appeared that both of the solid rocket boosters survived the explosion. Now, if the parachute recovery system is working on those 2 solid rocket boosters and they come down in the ocean and are recovered, they should be a very valuable piece of evidence and information for the Accident Investigation Board. And unfortunately, this question did not come up in the briefing, so at this point in time, we don't know whether the SRBs, the solid rocket boosters, did come down on parachute or not.
Leo Krupp, what are we to make of this information that a derrick arm, part of the preparation for the space shuttle, a derrick arm had hit one of the tanks on Saturday, and that NASA, in effect, had closed the pad, the launch pad, to deal with that? Now, Jess Moore said that had been looked into, and NASA is satisfied that nothing was harmed. Does that raise any special questions in your mind?
No, I think Mr. Moore said that it hit a box of some sort, and it only penetrated a 5-inch insulation, an inch or so, and it was repaired, and it appears to have absolutely no significance at all to this accident. However, I'm sure they'll look into it. The NASA will not overlook anything when they look into this investigation.
For those of you, thank you very much, Leo Krupp in Los Angeles, and stay with us if you will, please. NASA has just completed its first news conference of the day, its first official word. All 7 Americans aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger are apparently dead in the ball of flame that happened just after liftoff this morning. President Reagan is preparing to talk to the American people in about 7 or 8 minutes. CBS News will, of course, cover that live. The catastrophic explosion blew apart the Space Shuttle Challenger between 72 and 75 seconds after liftoff today, apparently sending schoolteacher Krista McAuliffe and 6 NASA astronauts to a fiery death in the sky some 8 miles out from the Kennedy Space Center. The victims of the crash were Commander Major Francis Dick Scobie, 46 years old, from Auburn, Washington. Pilot Michael Mike Smith, graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy, 40 years old, from Beaufort, North Carolina, married and the father of 3 children. Major Scobie was the father of 2 children. Judith Resnick, mission specialist and astronaut, single, 36 years old, from Akron, Ohio. Mission specialist Ronald McNair, 35 years old, from Lake City, South Carolina, and a graduate of MIT, his second space flight. Mission specialist Ellison Onizuka, 39 years old, from Hawaii, an Air Force colonel. This was his second flight. And Greg Jarvis, payload specialist and employee of Hughes Aircraft, 41 years old, married, made his home in Spring Valley, New York, an electrical engineer. His job was to conduct experiments on how liquids behave in the weightless space. And Susan Krista McAuliffe, 37-year-old teacher, mother of 2, born in Boston, a high school social studies teacher in Concord, New Hampshire. She was the teacher who had been selected from more than 11,000 who applied to be NASA's first citizen in space. They all today apparently died trying to get into space. Coming up soon, President Reagan's talk to the American people about this. We mentioned that debris from the space shuttle rained down for some 45 minutes just southeast of the launch site at Cape Canaveral. We have an interview with a Coast Guard lieutenant who witnessed today's tragic accident involving the Space Shuttle Challenger. Lieutenant Dave Baird was flying on a commercial jet over the launch site.
It looked like a kid's airplane being hit by the wind, and it didn't appear that anything could have survived from our vantage point. Basically, it looked like it just tore itself to shreds and was on fire.
At Coast Guard headquarters in Miami, ships were dispatched to the crash area to help search for bodies and debris. Very little debris has been found. No bodies have been recovered. In a moment now, what we're going to do is show you the videotape of this morning's launch, and then slow motion the videotape. As preparation for that, you might want to point out that this was the configuration of the space shuttle as it took off this morning. This is the orbiter, the Space Shuttle Challenger. The liquid fuel is in the large tank. The solid rocket boosters off to the side. The shuttle, of course, has 3 engines of its own. The solid rocket boosters in the shuttle's own 3 engines all have to be at full throttle for the liftoff. Then the commander throttles back to about 60-65% of full throttle and then has to throttle forward again. And it was that second throttle forward, just after he had done that, that the explosion occurred. Here was the launch this morning from Cape Canaveral, Florida.
2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Now controlling program. Roger, roll, Challenger. Good roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading down range. Engines beginning throttling down now at 94%. Normal throttles for most of the flight, 104%. We'll throttle down to 65% shortly. Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs. Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles. Downrange distance 3 nautical miles. Engines throttling up. 3 engines now at 104%. Challenger, go at throttle up. Challenger, go at throttle up. One minute, 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
Half an hour after the explosion, a serpentine trail of white smoke. It was twisted by the upper wind, and that smoke remained in the cold, clear sky, marking the path of the shuttle's wreckage. The explosion occurred about the time the shuttle was to enter a period of maximum aerodynamic pressure. Wind and other atmospheric conditions placed the maximum force on the outside of the space vehicle. And now what happened in slow motion detail. You'll want to look first for what may have been a couple of little vapor indications of flame. You can begin to see them shortly. This is about 60 seconds into the launch, if you will, and then the larger explosion. See what appears to be vapor flames at the base in the left-hand side of the screen. Now the main fuel tank begins to ignite and explode. As we wait for President Reagan to address the American people, you will note in the upper right-hand quarter of your screen what appears to be an entire, or almost entire, there it is, upper quarter of the screen, piece of what is believed to be the right solid rocket fuel booster. Now, when Leo Krupp was saying a few minutes ago that those boosters are supposed to parachute into the sea and are possibly recoverable, you can see how that large a piece of debris, if it can be found, might indeed be very valuable in the investigation. Now, as we await, that's what happened this morning, both in real-time videotape and the slow-motion videotape. And as we await President Reagan's talk to the American people, you may want to ponder a poem called High Flight by John Gillespie McGee, Jr., a 19-year-old American volunteer with the Royal Canadian Air Force who was killed in training December 11th, 1941. And he wrote a poem called High Flight. And it reads, "Oh, I have slipped the surly bonds of earth and danced the skies on laughter-silvered wings. Sunward I've climbed and joined the tumbling mirth of sun-split clouds and done 100 things you have not dreamed of, wheeled and soared and swung high in the sunlit silence. Hovering there, I've chased the shouting wind along and flung my eager craft through footless halls of air. Up, up the long, delirious, burning blue. I've topped the wind-swept heights with easy grace, where never lark or even eagle flew. And while with silent, lifting mind I've trod the high, untrespassed sanctity of space, put out my hand and touched the face of God." In the wake of the explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger at Cape Canaveral, Florida, this morning, shortly before noon Eastern Time, we take you now to the White House in Washington for a talk by the President of the United States.
15 seconds. 10 seconds. Stand by, please.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd planned to speak to you tonight to report on the State of the Union. But the events of earlier today have led me to change those plans. Today is a day